So, welcome to what is the second in 5 presentations on the subject of the Belfast Blitz, which is being brought to you by the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland War Memorial. My name is Stephen Scarth. I'm Head of Public Services at the Public Record Office, which we tend to refer to as PRONI. Before I pass on to our guest speaker today, I just want to highlight next week's talk, also on Thursday. It's called Putting the Pieces Together. And this is all going to be about archives and footage. So we're going to have Anne Donnelly from Northern Ireland Screen, my colleague Jan Hancock talking about PRONI sources. And we were going to have in the program, it says Jenny Haslett from the War Memorial. It will now be Alan Freeborn, who will represent the War Memorial, but that'll be the same talk. So please join in next week for what will be a lively and very entertaining session. Today's speaker is, well, before I actually get to Trevor, I just want to say a bit of housekeeping. Just that everybody is muted because there's 117 of you, 118, and the background noise would just be ridiculous. As we will be taking questions, so just put any questions you have in chat. And my colleague Lindsay is going to go through those at the end of the talk, which will be 45 minutes. The talk is being recorded, so if you don't want your face to appear in the recording, just hit the stop video. The video itself is being filmed and will be made available through YouTube, and we will give links out on both the PRONI and the War Memorial websites in due course. And as I said, there's still places for next week's talk as well, so we'll be delighted to see you then. So today's presentation is the morning after. It's about Emma Duffin, a VAD, who participated along with her sisters in the First World War, where she served overseas. Slightly different story in the Second World War, where she's in charge of operations up at Stranmillis Hospital, and then does a walkabout the day after. And Trevor's going to talk us through that. Trevor himself is retired from the National Museums for 10 years now. He used to work he was a keeper at the Ulster Museum. And before that, he had another life as a deputy keeper in the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland. Trevor is also author of 2 volumes on Emma Duffin, transcribed from her archives, which are at PRONI. The first one are diaries of the First World War. The second one is more applicable to today's talk, which is on the Blitz and her walk, which we're going to hear about now. So, folks, without any more ado, I'm going to pass you over to Trevor for the morning after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that introduction. And welcome to the audience. I'd better explain that if I don't maintain eye contact with you all individually, it's because I'm reading this paper. Don't you hate people who just come along the way Brian Barton did last week with nary a note, talked for an hour? So I'll be reading this, and then Lindsay will be operating the slides as we go along. So if you can bear with this and bear for 45 minutes, I can begin away. To remind you, the title is The Morning After the Night Before. Emma Duffin's street-level tour of North Belfast following the Blitz of the 15th to the 16th of April. And isn't it nicely appropriate that this is the 15th of April, exactly 80 years on from that cataclysmic event? And I was very glad to have been invited by both the Northern Ireland War Memorial and the Public Record Office to participate in this commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Blitz. The War Memorial, under the chairmanship of Ian Wilson, was good enough to publish my edition of Emma Duffin's World War II diary, A Nurse in the Belfast Blitz, still on sale, to mark the 75th anniversary in 2016. And of course, I was on PRONI staff for 25 years, as Stephen has said. It's perhaps worth observing at this point, the 80th anniversary. It marks the point at where the events of that devastating raid already graphically outlined last week by Brian Barton, can be said to have passed out of living memory, nearly, and makes the documentary evidence, that's written, oral, film, and not least artefactual, all the more important. And it's on Emma Duffin's eyewitness account of her journey through Belfast the morning after the night before, as the title of this talk indicates, that will feature largely in this presentation. It's part of the extensive and very significant Duffin family archive that is in the care of PRONI, her diary, kept while she was a commandant of the Voluntary Aid Detachment post based at Stranmillis Cottage, which had become a military hospital during the war. Also provides many useful observations on the lead up to the outbreak of war and the preparations, such as they were, designed to protect Belfast from an almost certain aerial bombardment. And rather poignantly, it also records her ultimately shabby treatment at the hands of an otherwise unfeeling "there's a war on, you know" mentality, which took little or no account of her status. She was the commandant at Stranmillis, or her age. Born in 1883, she was by then in the Second World War and serving in an entirely voluntary capacity in her late 50s. Most tellingly of all, as Stephen has said, Emma had herself served as a VAD nurse for 4 years in World War I. First in Egypt from 1915, where she tended the wounded in the Dardanelles campaign, and then from 1916, arriving in France just before the cataclysmic event of the Somme, she served at the front in several hospitals in Le Havre in northern France, for which dedication she had been mentioned in dispatches. Next slide, Lindsay, please. Hi. Lindsay, thank you. That's her diary, and you can see that she's quite a strong-minded woman, even from the photograph, pasted inside, and the diary that she then set out to write in 1939. Next slide, Lindsay, please. That's her being mentioned in dispatches. Emma Sylvia Duffin, mentioned in dispatches in the bottom line, born in Dunowen on the Cliftonville Road, and you can see there that as a voluntary aid detachment nurse in the First World War, she received the princely sum of £20 a year. She only served for 6 months at a time, of course, so she only got £10. Next slide, Lindsay. She was a remarkable person. She was a book illustrator. She also, when she went to Egypt and then France, she took a photograph with her, a camera with her. So this is her just in 1912, a handsome woman, aged about 29. Next slide. And that's her in her VAD uniform. Next slide. Her diaries that she kept while on active service, as it were. Next slide. Unusually, she was able to take photographs of patients in Egypt, which she then recorded. Next slide. When she went to France, she served in Le Havre. This is a photograph of her off duty at the officers' hospital. There were separate hospitals for the officers and for the men. And curiously, she made the observation that she was more at home serving the Tommies than she was in serving officers, because they were more from her class. And she was slightly discomfited by serving them. Next slide. At the end of the war, she had heard about Ypres so much that she stayed on for a few months after the end of the war to mop up, as it were. And during that time, she went with a couple of friends to visit Ypres, of which, wipers as the soldiers called it, of which she had heard so much from the men that she tended to in the hospitals. Next slide. She resumed her diary keeping as soon as during her time, she kept a record, as we have seen. She resumed her diary keeping as soon as the radio news announced the outbreak of war in September 1939. And as an aside, it's very evident that her World War II diary, the extent to which she and most of the population depended on the wireless as a means of being informed. She bemoans in her diary the coverage by the BBC, and because she could speak German fluently, she had worked there as a governess before the war. She often listened to broadcasts from Hamburg and elsewhere, including Hitler's often blood-curdling speeches. Next slide. She notes in the first page of her diary, during the 1914-18 war, I kept a diary, and though it was not written, it may have someday be of interest. It is unlikely that in this war I will be able to take any active part. On this account, this diary will probably be less interesting, and I may later decide that it is not worth keeping. But I will begin by recording some of our impressions before and the outbreak of war. It might be appropriate at this stage to paint in some of Emma's personal and family background. Emma's mother and father, Maria and Adam Duffin, he was a prosperous businessman and liberal unionist politician, had 9 children, 7 of them girls. Emma and her sisters inherited a tradition of public service, particularly from her mother, Maria, who herself was the granddaughter, of Dr. William Drennan, one of the Northern Liberals instrumental in forming the Society of United Irishmen in Belfast in October 1791. All 7 Duffin girls were educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College in Gloucestershire at no small cost, and then at home by mostly German governesses. At least 3 of Emma's sisters also served as VAD nurses in one capacity or another, either in England or Ireland, and they kept up a voluminous correspondence with their parents. The Duffin family commitment to public service had seen Emma in the interwar years become associated with what was to become the Belfast Council of Social Welfare. Next slide, Lindsay, please. Her mother, Maria, who lived until she was 100, dying in 1954, had been closely involved in the establishment in 1906 of the forerunner of the Belfast Council of Social Welfare, here based at Bryson House. Emma continued the family commitment by becoming Honorary Secretary of the Council in 1929, a role she was to hold for 25 years until the mid-1950s. She took particular interest in establishing what was termed the Aftercare Committee. This aimed to help people, especially mothers, who, having been discharged from hospital treatment, may or may not have been in a position to resume their normal domestic duties immediately. It was in that context that, in 1940, when she was invited to resume her service with the Voluntary Aid Detachment St. John's Ambulance Unit, located at the military hospital, which had been established at Stranmillis, the students had been evacuated, as you may know, from Stranmillis to Facets Hotel in Portrush. Not as palatial a location as it might sound, there being no heating in the building when they arrived there, and Portrush in midwinter being what it was and still is. It was entirely in keeping not only with her own, but the Duffin family's commitment to public service that she reluctantly accepted the position. She notes in her diary, next slide, Lindsay, please. I had been approached to know if I would take the post of Commandant in Stranmillis Military Hospital, and rather reluctantly agreed to take it, as I had put my name down at the beginning of the war to serve if called on. I wondered if I was doing the right thing. As I passed through the gates, I thought of my first day's duty in hospital in Alexandria. Life held more possibility for me in 1915 than it did in 1940. Well, she said, I would have to do my best. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. It might also be worth drawing a comparison between her First World War diaries and the one she kept in the early 1940s. Her record of time in France is in effect memoirs, not least because by the very nature of her sometimes interminable stints of duty on the wards, she could only write up her experiences in some detail when she was demoted in 1919. Her Belfast diary in 1940 is altogether different. It was written up more regularly and has the added value of recording the experiences of civilians under fire, as it were. The First World War, although it affected practically every family in Britain and Ireland, was fought over there. And apart from Zeppelin raids in London and elsewhere, the civilians at home remained relatively uninvolved. The Second World War, perhaps for the first time in modern warfare, brought war on an industrial scale to the population's doorstep, mostly in the form of aerial bombing raids. And Emma's diary serves as a first-hand account of how the city and the people of Belfast were affected and how they responded. The lack of preparedness of the Northern Ireland government in the years immediately before and even in the early days of the war has been well documented, not least by Brian Barton in his book, The Belfast Blitz. Barton pulls no punches when he says that, quotes, although experts had informed Stormont ministers in early 1939 that Belfast was a likely Luftwaffe target, few steps were taken to prepare it for war. As for protecting Belfast itself, whose manufacturing industrial sites were an obvious target, Barton concludes that, quotes, the city's passive defences were equally ill-prepared. Nothing in Emma's diary entries run counter to this diagnosis of lethargic preparation by what has been described in another context as a part-time government. Her diary reflects the mounting concern and apprehension as the news came through that one by one, Western European countries succumbed to German invading forces. Emma spoke fluent German, having spent a year as a governess in Germany before the First World War. When she found the BBC broadcast, quotes, disappointing, slight, frivolous programmes, uninspired, they gave one a they give one a feeling that they are fiddling while Rome burns. She was therefore able to tune in on long-wave radio to broadcasts from France and Germany. The sense of mounting drama is, if anything, increased by her description of listening to speeches from Nazi Germany. Next slide, Lindsay, please. Sometimes we turned the wireless to Berlin or Hamburg and heard Hitler, hoarse, choked with indignation, shouting, yelling his creed. Here, she said, was a vision of a madman. Goebbels shrieking, howling and cursing. Back to London and the quiet, controlled, educated voice of an English announcer, if anything, too unemotional, telling of our losses at sea, of French gains, of airmen's flights with propaganda sheets over Germany. Her work as commandant turned out to be largely an administrative, superintending the VAD nurses who were in her charge, about 100 of them. She occasionally gives vent to her frustration in her diary with the military bureaucracy she encountered. Quote, every difficulty was put in the way. I said bitterly later that fighting in France in the First World War was nothing to the fighting that went on to get anything done in the army in the Second World War. Immediately on taking her duties at Stranmillis, she spent 2 weeks at the main army base in Aldershot in Hampshire, where she learned more about the administrative and bureaucratic nature of her position and her role superintending the nurses. On return to Belfast, her administrative tasks and struggles with army bureaucracy were resumed. She was particularly mindful of ensuring that the nurses in her care were suitably provided for, though as she ruefully observed, quotes, it was extraordinary how one had to struggle for the most obvious necessities. She describes a few desultory evacuation and fire drills that were practiced at Stranmillis. As was apparent elsewhere in Northern Ireland, and particularly at government level, there appeared to be no general concern. However, from June 1940, when Germany had invaded France, Belfast came more easily within striking distance of the German bombers. Emma noted, quotes, we had a few air raid warnings and orders and counter orders regarding them, nothing else. Nonetheless, the city, as she remarks, had been singularly free from air raid warnings until April 1941. It was all about to change dramatically. Next slide, sorry. Lindsay. On Tuesday, she says, on Tuesday, April 1541, brackets, which happened to be Easter Tuesday, I was awakened by the sirens at 10:45. She obviously had gone to bed quite early. As Emma's opening observation of what would turn out to be a remarkable testimony to the aftermath of a 4-hour bombardment by nearly 200 German bombers. She describes the sounds of the bombs which fell throughout the long night, mainly in the northern part of the city, well away from Stranmillis, where she was based. The Stranmillis Military Hospital, quotes, got a few casualties, but when Emma checked up on her other area of responsibility, that's the Donegal Road Military Hospital, she found that the VAD nurses there had become upset by the lorries continually arriving, bearing dead bodies for the mortuary. It remained a mystery why, given that Belfast was a recognized German target because of its industrial and shipbuilding output, it was residential areas, particularly in the north of the city, that took the full brunt of the German aerial attack. For there is little doubt that the Blitz on Belfast on that night is the single most traumatic event in the city's long and often troubled history. Barton reminds us that during the two raids, 15th and 16th of April and the 4th and 5th of May, quotes, over 380 bombers participated and 440 tons of high explosives were dropped, along with 125,000 incendiary bombs. More than that, in a United Kingdom context, it's worth remembering that close on 800 Belfast inhabitants were killed that night, more in one night than in any other British city outside London. On Thursday the 17th, the day after the Easter Tuesday raid had come to an end in the early hours of Wednesday, Barton calculates the raid lasted until between 3:30 and 4 a.m. Emma undertook to travel to the top of Oldpark Road in North Belfast, where curiously she was already scheduled to give one of a series of first aid talks to the Women's Voluntary Service. It's only then that the full extent of the damage on her journey became fully apparent. Her itinerary from the city centre took her by one means or another through some of the most badly affected areas. She found her way quite intrepidly, given the extent of the extension that the 4-hour raid had brought, particularly to the northern parts of the city, through ruined streets. Next slide, Lindsay. That's Annandale Street past Royal Avenue. Next slide, Lindsay. Onto the Oldpark Road. She passed the Mater Infermorum Hospital, quotes, where many victims had been taken. Her route on foot from the city centre would quite possibly have taken her into Unity Street, the scene of a devastating direct hit on an air raid precaution post in which 12 people were killed outright. Jimmy Doherty, an Antrim Road man on duty as an ARP, later published his memoirs, in which he recalled that after witnessing the initial bombardment of the Victoria Barracks, he decided to return to his post. The ARP post number 396 was located at 20A Unity Street, which lay under the shadow of Trinity Street Church and adjacent to Victoria Barracks. Seconds later, he said, the parachute mine struck the imposing spire of the Trinity Street Church and exploded instantly. It was the worst single incident in the history of the Air Raid Precaution Service. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission bears the names of 35 people who lost their lives in Unity Street alone. Indeed, as Emma made her way up the Crumlin Road, she describes, quote, little side streets in ruins, houses reduced to rubble. Next slide. Manor Street on the Cliffville runs between the Cliffville Road and the Oldpark. Next slide. The Crumlin, and a very iconic image of the Crumlin Road Presbyterian Church, which was absolutely devastated, as you can see. And the fire services already, and the ambulance services already on hand in the foreground. Emma was not specific about the public elementary school in the Oldpark area where her scheduled talk was to be delivered. It could well have been Oldpark Public Elementary School, in which case her journey on foot would have taken her past Ballymuir Street. Next slide, please. Where almost 30 people were killed. Brian Barton records that, quote, Mary Mulvenna lived there. On Tuesday night, he said, her house was crowded with family and friends attending her uncle's wake when it was struck by a bomb. 9 of those present died, and the explosion, macabrely enough, blew her uncle's corpse, quote, out of the coffin and out of the house. It was found sometime later up an alleyway. So confused was everything that night, she recalled. It is evident from newspaper accounts of the inquiries held into the coroner's court that other poignant incidents took place in or near Ballymuir Street. The reported case of James Clark, a coachman, who told a harrowing story. His house, number 4, had taken a direct hit, and he had lost his father, a post office official, his mother, 6 brothers, and also his married sisters and her daughter, who had sought shelter in the family home as soon as they'd heard the sirens go off. In another instance, noted by Brian Barton, Arthur Knight, also of Ballymuir Street, informed the coroner's court that he had gone out to work on Easter Tuesday night, and he had not seen any of his family since, neither his wife Grace nor his son or daughter, who were both in their teens. The coroner sympathetically observed, if you had not gone tonight, you would probably have gone too. Arthur replied, I wish I had been with them. When she arrived at the venue, Emma realized that, of course, there was no point in giving the talk. In the course of her weary way back to the city centre, quotes, there were no trams, buses were so crowded there was no hope of a seat. She witnessed, quotes, demolition squads and military digging frantically, and met everywhere people with parcels or suitcases struggling to get away. Who could blame them, she said. Travelling on foot as she did, she encountered displaced and bombed out victims, including, quotes, as she put it, a friendly little person who had been a VAD in the last war, like me, who had come to look for a friend but had found her gone. Undaunted, and in spite of her harrowing journey through such scenes of devastation, the following day, the 3rd after the Blitz, she returned to the northern part of the city. Next slide, Lindsay, please. To look in on the nurses' home in Frederick Street. As, quote, she said, I had been on the committee in pre-war days. I thought I would go around and inquire for the matron. She found that the patients had been moved to nearby Clifton House, the oldest established charity in Belfast, and which almost miraculously, in the midst of it all, had emerged from the night's raid largely unscathed. She went to Sheridan Street, off the Lower Antrim Road, close to Carlisle Circus, where lived 2 elderly spinster sisters named Addis, who had been long-term Duffin family friends. The lower part of the Antrim Road, in the streets adjacent to Carlisle Circus, had been particularly badly affected, Annandale Street in particular. Sheridan Street was close by. For the first time in her recording, Emma allows an element of motion to come into her commentary. The 2 old Addis's house was reduced to powder, she had found. 2 poor, little, inoffensive old maids, whose chief interest was the goings and comings of the society about them. On Easter Monday, only 3 days earlier, Minnie had come as usual to the Duffin household, had her gossip, her flowers, had her train fare, and had departed. Such an unlikely place to die in the front line, facing Hitler. Was any human being, she said, ever before responsible for so much misery? It's worth mentioning at this stage that the two eldest sisters she mentions, Minnie, that's Mary, and Sarah, are listed in the appendix to Brian Barton's The Belfast Blitz. The appendix is civilian deaths in Northern Ireland that resulted from the German air raids. This 50-page memorial listing the names of those known to have been killed is a lasting monument to their memory and a piece of painstaking research that, in my view, is worth the price of the book alone. Next slide, please. On her way to Sheridan Street, she would have passed Atlantic Avenue, scene of yet more obliterated houses, as you can see. Barton observes, quotes, "In this district, as in many parts of North Belfast, there really was nowhere safe for people to go during the raids." Sean O'Sullivan, an ex-Irish Army officer in Belfast as an observer, reported that, quote, "Close to Atlantic Avenue, he counted 5 direct hits within an area less than 100 yards across. Damage by fires and high explosives were so intermixed that it presented a checkerboard appearance. Scores of houses, he said, were completely wrecked, either by explosives, fire or blast, while hundreds were uninhabitable. Practically every house, he said, had suffered some damage." One of the bombs had scored a direct hit on a bomb shelter located at Atlantic Avenue. Government records indicate that 38 people died in the Atlantic Avenue shelter alone, and 18 were rescued. Some of the other shelters in this neighbourhood performed more effectively. A mine fell on the lower Antrim Road between Hillman Street and Duncairn Gardens. Eyewitnesses recall seeing its parachute, quotes, hanging from the tram wires. Next morning, it wrecked 3 very large houses in the immediate area, and across the street, St. James's Church was devastated by blast damage and fire. Clearly in this district, as in many parts of North Belfast, there really was nowhere safe for people to go during the raid. It's perhaps worth noting at this stage, after Emma had spent 2 days traipsing around the seriously damaged streets of Crumlin, Oldpark and Antrim, that she herself had been born in the Cliftonville Road in 1883. As you may have seen in the mentioned in dispatches, she had been born at Donovan House on the Cliftonville Road. That was a Duffin family home before the removal in the 1920s to Mount Pleasant in the Stranmillis area. Donovan House was located just beside, if you remember, the former Cliftonville cricket ground, and was later to become the home of the Poor Clare sisters. There's not enough time to tell you about the great innings I once played at Cliftonville cricket ground, but maybe that'll be another lecture further down the line. And yet, in the midst of all this, apparently Emma didn't think to stop and see if her own house in which she had been born was still standing. It was. The immediate impulse in the aftermath of the Easter raids was to set and train a large-scale migration of families fleeing the city. John Oliver, a civil servant involved in organising in July 1940, almost a year previously, a scheme to encourage citizens to evacuate, testifies in his memoir, Working at Stormont, to the fact that literally no one turned up in July 1940. Indeed, he and his fellow civil servants had so little time, had so little to do, that they had enough time to bowdlerize the Lewis Carroll poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter. And they had, quotes, wept like anything to see. Next slide, sorry, Lindsay. Oh yes, just a couple of images there from the Antrim Road. A quite iconic image of Salisbury Avenue bus depot, just beside which William Connor, the artist, lived. So in the midst of all that, you can see why Connor's house had been damaged so drastically. Next slide. And that's Halliday's Road. Go ahead. And Eglinton Street. And the next one, please. Percy Street devastation again. Another shelter had been devastated. Next slide. They had wept like anything to see such quantities of fleas, such lousy little Protestants, such nitty young RCs. Next slide. One of my publications in the museum featured a Millennium publication in 2000. We featured that photograph from the museum photographic collections. That is the Butler family, which in 2000, all but one of them, there were 9 children, All but one of them were still alive. They'd been evacuated to Dublin. As you can see, they were taking the train to Dublin. They'd been evacuated to Dublin and had returned in due course, and obviously that became an iconic image of the evacuation process. Next slide. Emma herself made some observations. She said that, quotes, "The usual tales were told of the incredible dirt of the people, of children crawling with lice, not even house trained, who destroyed mattresses, stuffed clothes down WCs in order to get new ones. A woman turning up with naked children who were fully clothed at the centre, and the same woman turning up at another rest centre the following day, the babies once more naked. A quote, a terrible indictment," said Emma, "of our way of life." It was observations such as these in towns and cities throughout war-torn and Blitz Britain that created the conditions for the official inquiry conducted by William Beveridge, whose report in December 1942 recommending that a comprehensive social care system should become more of a state responsibility, that created something of a template for the post-war welfare state. Next slide. Exacting as all this was, Emma's day spent on duty at St. George's Market on the Saturday after the Blitz proved to be as challenging as anything she had yet encountered. Responding to a request from her younger sister, Molly, she reported for duty to what was the most spacious repository where unidentified bodies of bomb victims could be laid out. This with a view to helping their positive identification, mainly by grieving surviving family members. Having endured the previous harrowing days, both on the streets of the devastated city and at the military hospital where she was based, Emma undertook the task because, quotes, in her view, quotes, "It was a job for an older woman, and my experience at the hospital should have prepared me to some extent." Next slide, please. I say should have, because she braced herself for what was in front of her. She describes the scenes that met her when she got there. The scene at St. George's. The place was full of coffins, some varnished, but the majority plain deal. At the end of the hall was a Salvation Army mobile canteen. Red Cross and St. John ambulance nurses and some civilians met and went round with relatives. Two men went round with each. Two men went round with each group and opened the coffins, lifting the lids. There were two doctors in attendance. All the way to the place I had told myself I was bound to see horrible sights, that only when seen could the full horror be realized. There she accompanied relatives looking. I'll let you read that again. It sort of disappeared when I was talking. Two men went round with each group and opened the coffins, lifting the lids. There were two doctors in attendance. All the way to the place I had told myself I was bound to see horrible sights, but only when seen could the full horror be realized. There she accompanied relatives looking for lost ones. In the course of this macabre search, they had to look into coffins that had been only generally marked with descriptions such as a young girl, dark hair, or a fair girl wearing a necklace. The ghastliness was, if anything, made all the greater by her finding a young girl, coach of about 7 or 8, sitting on a chair waiting for her mother. How anyone could have allowed a child, says Emma, to enter that hall of death, I do not know. Poignantly, her thoughts went back to her experience nearly a quarter of a century earlier and her time as a VAD nurse in northern France. Her current Belfast experience in St. George's Market brought to mind her close association with dead bodies in the First World War. Next slide, please. There, she said, I had seen death in many forms, young men dying of ghastly wounds, but they had died in hospital beds, their eyes reverently closed. Death had been made decent, solemn, tragic, and dignified. Here it was grotesque, repulsive, and horrible. No attendant nurse had soothed the last moments of these victims. With tangled hair, staring eyes, their grey-green faces covered with dust, they lay bundled in their coffins. Death, she said, should be dignified and peaceful. Hitler had made even death grotesque. All this unremitting gloom and destruction is only partially tempered by her slightly incongruous observation. As she staggers out of St. George's Market at the end of her harrowing day, she laments, will I ever be able to bring myself to buy fruit and vegetables there again? Barden calculates that, according to official figures, possibly more than 26 bodies were brought to St. George's Market. 92 were identified and given funerals. The remains of 34 found their last resting place in a shared plot at the city cemetery, where I believe some of the memorial staff are today, laying wreaths at those plots. They had lost their lives in 9 streets in North and West Belfast, including Hogarth Street, Sussex Street, York Street, and Percy Street. The impact of the raid witnessed by citizens of Belfast can be measured in J.W. Blake's assessment in his official history of the Second World War, in which he claims that, quotes, no other city in the United Kingdom except London lost so many of her citizens in a single night. This is a view that Barton continues to share. In terms of the number of casualties, Barton concludes that, quote, there is broad agreement that approximately 745 civilians died in Belfast as a result of the Easter Tuesday raid. He also acknowledges that this does not include military fatalities suffered on the same evening. One of the criticisms levelled at the Belfast Corporation in the interwar years had been the lamentable new housing policy. Jonathan Barton, in his History of Ulster, avers that the Belfast Corporation built only 16 houses by direct contract in the interwar years and subsidised the construction of 2,600 others. The destruction of housing caused by the Blitz only added to this housing crisis. 1,200 were destroyed, 5,000 houses badly damaged, and 20,000 slightly damaged by the 1941 air raids. Next slide. The demolition, of course, in a sense, created the circumstances for a new beginning, removing the old slums and possibly putting up new ones. Next slide. Next slide. The second major air raid on the Sunday, the 4th of April, was equally damaging. This time the Luftwaffe did find their industrial targets to the extent that only 199 people were killed. As she listened to the quotes, the thuds and the bombs throughout that long night, Emma reflected somewhat resignedly on her experience of the April air raid. Quotes, having seen those pathetic streets smashed to dust, those distorted bodies, the horror was brought home to me more, but I'm glad to say, though I felt horrified that night, the second night, I did not feel fear. It's perhaps worth making a point at this stage about the general historical value of Emma's diary. War has historically been an agent for expediting social change, none more so than World War II, which highlighted the need for the radical and wholesale changes to the structure of British society that had become evident. Emma, in the course of her observations, makes interesting comment that somehow and almost accidentally she anticipates the far-reaching post-war changes that were to be introduced almost immediately following the khaki election of 1945. Even if she returned home in the early morning light to her quarters when the all clear was given, Emma was looking to a brighter future. She says, quotes, the grass was strewn with blackened and charred papers. There was a sheet from a child's essay book. On top of the page I read, the end of the world. It seemed appropriate. It was the end of the world as we knew it. Let us hope, she said, looking forward to the days beyond. It will be the beginning of a better one. Next slide. And in fact, that otherwise well-known wisdom of organ of wisdom and truth, the County Down Spectator, only a few weeks after the Blitz, made this comment in its editorial. The Blitz, said the County Down Spectator, has brought home to us the amount of absolute destitution in the poorer quarters of Belfast. And then it said, Hitler has done these poor folk a service by destroying their homes, and we hope the downtrodden amongst us are to have a better chance after the war. So that sort of sense of the realization that out of the trauma would come something, would be constructed something a bit more civilized. Emma resumed her normal duty as VAD Commandant, returning to her daily and largely administrative routine of superintending the VAD nurses. She found that not only was the Army's bureaucratic inflexibility as frustrating as it had been before, but unfortunately for her, her relationship with the recently appointed matron of the hospital continued to be a source of disappointment. Matters came to a head when Emma felt that she and her VADs had been misled over the arrangements they had been making for an end-of-year dance, perhaps their only major social engagement of the year, and an occasion, as Emma knew well from her First World War experience, which was a focal point of the nurses' social year. After this disagreeable episode, Emma moved to the military hospital located at Bangor, and although she was able to live with her sister in Hollywood, rather than tolerate the comparatively inhospitable living quarters she had been offered, it nonetheless left her with something of a sour taste in her mouth as her sad postscript notes. Next slide. I was longing to get my discharge, but instead was transferred to Bangor. I look back at my time at Bangor with a feeling of disgust. I made my way to the billets I'd been offered, a gloomy house in a side street. The only one left was a tiny attic with an old iron bed. I confess my heart sank. I hung about aimlessly with nothing to do. I was thankful to get home in the evenings to the Randalls, that's her sister, in Hollywood. She had undergone the full range of wartime privations, all of which she would have cheerfully and stoically shrugged off. In this context, and even though Emma herself would have subscribed to the philosophy, there's a war on, you know, it does seem singularly inappropriate and unfair that this civilian volunteer, who initially as a young woman and then latterly as an experienced social administrator, had rallied to the cause in 2 world wars at home and abroad, could not have been left with a more deserving and fonder recollection of a service that was, by any standards, above and beyond the call of duty. Next slide. Over 25 years later, she adds a lengthy postscript to her World War II diary. She professes she couldn't quite recollect why she stopped keeping the diary, being too busy. However, it was almost certainly the changes proposed in the Elliott report affecting the status of VADs and specifically the rank of Commandant, that was Emma's rank, that betokened the beginning of the end of her World War II contribution. The report recommended that VAD nurses be assimilated into the auxiliary territorial service. Not only would they lose their prized volunteer status, but as the report put it, VAD personnel shall, in the same manner as members of the ATS, be subject to military law and be enrolled into the women's forces. At present, VAD personnel serving with the Army are only to a limited degree subject to military law as civilians. The report's justification of these thoroughgoing changes was hardly a worthy reflection on the contribution of thousands of VAD volunteers in both wars. The Army Council case for merger was twofold. It would enable the best use to be made of man and woman power. Many VAD members were people of high intelligence, the report said, and capacity, and it was felt that their gifts fitted them for something considerably better. On top of that, the rank of Commandant was to be disbanded entirely. Alarmed as much by the loss of her VAD charges as her own rank, Emma was provoked in June 1943, a year later, to write to Lady Edwina Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten's wife, Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. Her principal worries related to the anomalies of incorporating the VADs into the auxiliary territorial service. Emma wrote, many of the VADs have had 3 or 4 years experience, yet, as I understand it, they are now to hold the same ranks as the ATS do after 6 weeks, namely nursing orderlies. She also feared for discipline and respect on the wards. The patients, she said, call them by their first names, treat them with familiarity and no respect, and they share a mess with the hospital male orderlies. In my opinion, said Emma, it will inevitably lead to a lack of discipline in the wards. Her closing affirmation of loyalty cannot disguise her deep sense of disappointment. Needless to say, I will loyally abide by the committee's decision to do my best to see VADs accepted. I make no secret of the fact that I anticipate resentment and dismay when they learn of it. Emma had continued to serve throughout the war as Honorary Secretary of the Belfast Council of Social Welfare. Before the war, she had been the main instigator of an aftercare committee concerned to provide services for mothers and children on discharge. With the gradual introduction of post-1948 in Northern Ireland of a statutory welfare system, she became concerned to ensure that the new structures of the welfare state incorporated the main characteristics of the aftercare committee that she had been instrumental in establishing. She was part of a delegation to the Ministry of Home Affairs, which met on at least 2 occasions with senior civil servants on this issue of childcare. She was also involved in such matters as the raising of money in the wake of the Princess Victoria sinking disaster in 1953. Although she attained the age of 70 that year, it must have come as something of a surprise to the Belfast Council of Social Welfare that such a mainspring of its activity should announce her resignation from the post of Honorary Secretary. She stayed on the committee, however, until the 1960s. Next, I got this. No. Her public, no, sorry, could you go back to the slide? I beg your pardon. Her public service was recognised not only by a warm note of appreciation from the Council of Social Welfare, but also the following year in 1954 by the award of an Honorary Masters of the Arts by the Queen's University of Belfast. She was presented for the award by Professor E. Eston Evans, the distinguished historical geographer and ethnographer. His encomium observed that, quotes, years ago, the university honoured Miss Ruth Duffin, that's Emma's sister, distinguished first warden of Riddle Hall. It must be rare, said the encomium, short of royalty for two sisters to become honorary graduates of the same university. But the Duffin family, he said, was little short of royalty. In the tradition of public service, it had maintained through the generations. He continued, Miss Duffin showed a capacity for the practical application of her ideas. It was she who, after having seen and provided the need for aftercare services, initiated the Belfast Hospital's Aftercare Committee. In 1937, when the council's housing scheme was launched, it was Miss Duffin who fought masculine prejudices by insisting that the houses should have convenient kitchens as well as pleasing facades. Next slide. Emma Duffin's Second World War diary differs from those she had kept while serving in the First World War. It was ended up more regularly, principally because her circumstances allowed to put pen to paper more easily than had been the case when she was on duty in Alexandria or Le Havre. Having discontinued regular entries, she completes her story as late as 1967, when interestingly she feels freer than was the case a generation earlier to raise issues such as pregnancy among the nurses in her care, something that does not feature at all in her original diary entries, and her own disenchantment with the changes in regulations that effectively rendered her position redundant. She puts in a very poignant postscript, which somehow sums up her life. It had been a hard life, but a great experience, never to be regretted. We had seen great suffering, but greater courage. We had learned the value of comradeship and that barriers between classes could be ignored. An orderly could be a friend as well as an officer. A patient could be a brother. To me, she said, some of those men are more real than those I met perhaps a week or so ago. I can never forget them. And many I know will remember me. I was their sister, she said, in both senses. It's interesting that during the First World War, she rarely, if ever, questioned how it was being conducted and all the carnage that she was in the middle of. Her Second World War diary, on the other hand, is altogether more opinionated, mainly arising from her greater maturity and increasing frustration with army procedures, and to a certain extent on the position she held as a VAD Commandant with responsibility for up to 100 nurses. Additionally, the diary serves to record from an individual's perspective the impact of modern warfare, specifically aerial bombardment, on a civilian population. The extent to which the Second World War involved civilians to a previously unknown degree. It's interesting to note that it wasn't until 1943 that the number of military casualties outnumbered those of the civilians. All that is brought home in more senses than one by Emma's diary observations that sensitively and graphically, as befitted the book illustrator that she was, described one of the most cataclysmic events in Belfast history. Next slide. She died in 1979. She was buried with the family in Newcastle in the Church of Ireland graveyard there. Next slide. That's just a list of publications, modestly including my own, which may be interested. You'll be aware of Brian Moore's The Emperor of Ice Cream. Moore himself served as an ambulance driver, he being a schoolboy at St. Malachy's College at the time. It's a very good description. James Docherty was the ARP warden who wrote the book Post 381. Robert Harbison grew up in Belfast in the Donegal Road area. He wrote No Surrender. And then The Song of Earn is a description of him as an evacuee. Of all the Belfast people he was sent to County Fermanagh with, he was the only one who liked it. All the others hated it. John Oliver, working in Stormont, describes the print. And then the unpublished memoirs of Moya Woodside, Brian Barton has referred to, and William McCready, whose diary is in the Linden-Hall Library. Next slide. Just to finish off the presentation, I was unaware of this until very recently. So the Blitz Northern Ireland War Memorial have allowed me to present this slide. It was unveiled in 2009 by the Reverend Dr. Houston McKelvey, then Dean of Belfast, as a memorial to the Blitz. Next slide. And that's the detail of it. It was by Carolyn Mulholland, and on this and nicely, effectively done. And on this, the 80th anniversary, 15th of April, I thought it'd be a useful way to end this lecture and to take your questions, as long as they're not too hard. Thank you.